and also when we talk in general about data warehouses, which is loading data into our tables and databases. So this is a primary task that we have also in Snowflake, and therefore we want to cover this in really great detail. So in general, when we talk about loading data, we have two main methods basically of loading the data into our databases. The first one is bulk loading. So this is the most frequent and also the most important method. This uses the compute power of our warehouses. So we have to use our own warehouses for this. Our own capacity is used here. And this involves also so-called stages, which we talk about in more detail in the next lecture. So this is what we use, and here we use those stages where we load the data from, which we again talk about in the next lecture. How we create them, how we use them, and so on. So then we will also learn about the copy command, because this is the command that is used for this kind of loading. So this is just a secure command to load data from the stages into our table. So this also allows for data transformations. We can maybe clean the data or do some little transformations. So this is something that is also possible with bulk loading. And then we also have continuous loading, and as opposed to the bulk loading, which is, like the name suggests, we load the data in bulk. This can be periodically, but usually it is a more higher volume of data also. Continuous loading is, data that is needed very quickly, so it needs to be up to date. We need to have access to it immediately, but usually it's more smaller amounts of data. So here this uses the serverless features, so it will use not a dedicated warehouse that we have created, but it will use the serverless features, so the serverless warehouses that are managed by Snowflake. So this is Snowpipe, the feature that is used for continuous loading. We talk about this in more detail later on. For now, we want to focus more on the bulk loading, which is the most important one, using the copy command and stages and our warehouses. That's what we want to focus on first, because it's the most important one. And of course, later on, we also talk about continuous loading using Snowpipe. So in general, we now want to understand what are stages, how does it exactly work with loading data, what are the stages now, how we create them, and how we can work with them. That's what we now want to answer in the next data into Snowflake using the copy method, which is the most frequent method. We need to know about stages. So before we can dive into practice, let's briefly understand what are actually those stages. First of all, I want to say that those stages are not to be confused with the staging area, or sometimes also called stages, in the general concept of a data warehouse. So the stage as a general concept in the field of data warehousing, usually it's called staging, is not to confuse with this object in Snowflake. So the stage is basically an object in Snowflake. This is something that we create, and this is basically the location of the data files where the data can be loaded from. So here, the stage object that we create basically contains the location from where we load the data. This can be, for example, an AWS bucket, and in this stage object, we just store the location. So this database object called stage has properties associated to it, and one of those properties is, for example, the location. There can be also other properties like the credentials, so access to this location, so that we can easily load the data from this external location. So this is basically a database object with different properties, and we use it to load data. Basically, in some way, you can think of it as the location of the data and all of the located or the associated properties of the location, so that we can load the data from there. So this is what we are using this for. And here we have two types of stages. The most common type of stage is the external stage. So this is referring to the location, such as, for example, an AWS S3 bucket or Google Cloud Storage or an Azure Blob storage. So all of those external cloud providers where we store data. This is the most frequent type of a stage in Snowflake. And here we, basically the external cloud providers. Here, this is the external stage, and this is created within a database schema using the create stage command. So we just created, like for example, also a table, and then this is an object in our schema, in our database, basically. This is why it's a database object, and it includes properties like the URL, some access settings, and some additional settings that are also relevant to the connection. In regards to the cost, we have to consider that if the external stage is in a different region or a different platform than the one that is selected for our account. For example, let's say we have an AWS account selected for the Snowflake account. So we use the cloud provider AWS, and we have maybe the region US East. And then we have now a stage that is associated, or that is for a different region or a different cloud provider. Then this can occur additional data transfer cost because we load data from or to another location. So here this can occur, of course, then data transfer cost either in the cloud provider or also in our account. So depending on where we want to get the data out. So this is something that we have to just keep in mind, that there can be additional data transfer cost. For example, if you use an Azure account and you want to load the data from there, then of course you don't pay any incoming data in Snowflake, but you always pay for the outgoing data. So data that is transferred out of your account. So maybe in your Azure account, you have to consider that there might be additional cost associated with that. Additionally, we also have the internal stages. They are used when there is no access to an external cloud provider. So this can be, for example, a local file destination, such as, for example, an on-premise server that is maintained then by Snowflake. So here you have also this internal stage, which is, usually when we talk about a stage, we mostly refer to the external stage. So this is also the more frequently used one, the more important one, and therefore we will also first focus on those external stages. But now this is already enough of the theory, and we want to get started hands-on. We want to start to create our own first stage within our account using the create stage command, and then we want to dive deeper into these stages, how they work, and then also use them, of course, to load data practically hands-on. That's what we are doing in the next lectures.